Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Joan Ryan, author of the new book Intangibles, Unlocking the Science and Soul of Team Chemistry. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Joan Ryan. Joan is an award-winning sports journalist and author who has covered many different sports. In the interview, we discuss several really interesting topics, including what exactly is team chemistry and how does it differ from cohesion or camaraderie? How can we cultivate team chemistry and what are some of the mechanisms involved? Hope you enjoy. So today my guest is Joan Ryan, author of the new book Intangibles. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Joan.
Thanks, Robert.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in kind of sports writing and reporting?
Yeah, I always knew I wanted to work for newspapers. I was a really introverted kid but just loved reading the newspaper and being out there. But I was so shy that I actually, when I went to college to study journalism, I focused just on editing. So I'd be behind the scenes and I really didn't even write I was the editor of my high school paper, but really didn't write a whole lot. And ended up at the Orlando Sentinel as a copy editor. And, I thought, well, if I'm ever going to run this paper someday, I was introverted, but not without ambition. I needed to have some writing experience. And I really did always think that the best writing day in and day out in a newspaper was in the sports section for a lot of reasons. One of which is we already know the characters generally. It's sort of like we're just writing the next chapter. We're not, doing the heavy lifting of introducing this whole history to our readers. And so I thought, well, having said that, some of the worst writing in the newspaper is in the sports section too. So I give that. So anyway, I ended up in the sports section and started to get sent out on stories, and as horrible as that was for me initially, I thought, wow, this is way more fun than sitting in the newsroom. And bit by bit, I fell in love with it.
That's great. I like that analogy you described, the ongoing story. It is so true. We do get attached to the characters in sports, definitely. And so your new book is coming out soon, is about team chemistry. And for me, that's I think everyone would agree that it exists. It's important. But I think a lot of people would be, wow, that's a tough topic to tackle and define. And so kind of what inspired you to take on this really challenging issue of team chemistry?
Well, for all the years I wrote sports, which was, basically 2 decades, the thing that interested me the most were the people, and that's why I always wrote sports, is that I got to tell stories. And I wasn't as interested in, oh my God, we should fire this coach, or, the analytics didn't resonate that much with me when that emerged. So I always paid attention to the dynamics, within a clubhouse, within a locker room, out on the field, and just that human side of it. And so one day after I became the media consultant for the San Francisco Giants and I was writing books, I attended the 2009 reunion. In 2009, the reunion of the 1989 Giants, who reached the World Series, got swept by the A's, the Earthquake World Series. We all remember that. And that was my team, the late 80s teams, because I had just arrived from Florida where there were no baseball teams and baseball was my favorite sport. And all of a sudden, I'm in the clubhouse of the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's, but mostly the Giants. And there was something just so special about that 89 team because it shouldn't have worked. There were factions in that clubhouse that should have just cracked it right open. And instead, they had their arguments, they had their differences, but it always worked. And they came together and you could see that, these guys loved each other. They really, really did. And so now I'm at 20 years later at the 2009 reunion. I'm walking through, the big party tent they had put up outside the ballpark. And these middle-aged guys, 20 years later, you could see it in their eyes and hear it in their voices. And they still loved each other. And they talked about team chemistry, and they'd never been on a team like that before or after. So on the way home, this was after Moneyball and, the analytics is taking over. I just thought, and I loved Moneyball and I'm all in on the analytics. I think it's, hugely important. But on the way home, I'm thinking there's something. There is something there. And I realized I had never stopped to think, well, does it really exist? Or are we just, revisionist history looking back on something and saying, oh, well, those guys all liked each other and they all had beards and they seemed to be having fun, so they must have team chemistry. So I thought, well, does it exist? If it exists, what exactly is it? And how does it affect performance? Because if it doesn't affect performance, why are we even talking about it? It must affect performance. So I did take on this hugely ambitious project that now 10 years later has finally seen, well, it will on April 28th, finally see the light of day. It was the most fascinating book I've ever written and by far the most difficult.
I can only imagine. And we'll get back. I want to get back to ask, what team chemistry is and that example. But also I wanted to ask you kind of what other sources you looked at to find out about team chemistry. You mentioned the Giants. I think I remember you talking about some military sources as well. I'm assuming you went to research articles and things like that. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of where you look for the answer to what this is?
Sure. And, as as an academic, you start one place and that leads to 10 more, and those lead to 10 more, each one. So that part, the research was definitely the best part of this because my mind was blown. I mean, it really was blown by, reading about evolution. So the evolutionary biologists, the neuroscientists, I leaned, a lot on the neuroscientists. Organizational psychology. So tons of scientists, tons of books. I mean, I must have read, 30 to 40 books and just tore through them because they were so interesting and mostly about how humans influence one another and why we're tribal animals. And of course, a team is a tribe, and we could put them back in cave time and the dynamics would not be much different. And that's what I never really understood was biologically, physiologically, how much we influence one another. Our body language, our tone of voice, we can, our moods change with other people. We're more of I'm funnier with certain people than I am with others. I'm more articulate with others. So it's really looking at how we're these open loop creatures that absolutely depend on other people to complete us. And, I cite the sterile orphanages, right? Back in the, last turn of the century. And these babies weren't touched. They weren't cooed over. And 75% mortality rates at a lot of these orphanages because they could not, literally, their brains could not develop without contact, without that other human being completing that loop for them. And not long after I was at this reunion, my father died unexpectedly. My mother had died 9 months earlier, also unexpectedly. Mm-hmm. And 9 months later, my father just withered away. He stopped eating. He wasn't, the most robust man in the world, but he had nothing wrong with him. Mm-hmm. And apparently that's not an uncommon thing to happen. So I'm putting these pieces together and I'm just, like I said, I'm just kind of blown away by how profoundly, and the science is so clear on it, that we so profoundly influence each other. And so how could that not be happening every single day in a clubhouse, in a locker room, right? These guys live together, 6, 7, 8 months a year. Mm-hmm. So that's where I really, really started to understand the foundation of team chemistry. It's human chemistry, right? And so then the question is, how does it apply to a sports team or a business and affect their performance?
Yeah, no, I think that premature baby example is one that I use all the time in teaching. When I teach the sense of touch, how important it is for contact and human contact. And yeah, so let's get into the team chemistry. You've mentioned this word a couple of times, dynamics, right? So I'm assuming that the group dynamics and how the dynamics of communication and coordination is kind of important. But maybe what is team chemistry in your view?
Well, I mean, my one sentence is that, it's a complex confluence of factors that result in elevated performance. And then, there's a lot, as you can imagine, underneath that. But for a team for us to say a team has chemistry, we must see a improvement in the work product, whether in business or in team. Otherwise, it's just camaraderie. That's just fellowship. Mm-hmm. That's not, team chemistry is active. Fellowship is, basically static. It's almost a state of being. Cohesion is a state of being. And they're often used interchangeably, cohesion and camaraderie with team chemistry. But team chemistry is a biological construct. Mm-hmm. That incorporates the psychology and all the rest of it. But it does change how your body functions when you actually have chemistry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, you're right. It's hard to capture in one sentence what it is. But I'm guessing, so you mentioned the example of the Giants. They kind of had factions on the team. Is there any kind of structure that promotes, is it, the phrases I would use, top down, is it a coach that's kind of or bottom up where it kind of emerges from the players? Or I'm sure, there's probably different ways it can happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, everything has an impact. So, the leadership of the team, obviously, but to really kind of cut to the chase and going back to, you mentioned the military, like no entity has studied the importance of trust and bonding on performance, right? So, that has to be their trust and bonding. So what the military has found is that it's why they have the SEAL teams go through this rigorous training. And why do we have boot camp? Why do we march in place? There's no battle that exists today that soldiers are ever going to have to march in formation to. Yet we still do it because it helps to bond these guys. We put them through hell because it helps them bond these guys. So because what happens, what we know for hundreds and hundreds of years is that armies in battle that perform the best are the ones that are fighting for each other. They're not fighting for God and country. They're not even fighting to make history. They're fighting for each other because nothing else could keep them out there performing at the levels they are under unbearable stress. Now, luckily, sports teams don't have to go under unbearable stress, but the teams that perform the best, so obviously talent is the X factor. You can only be as good as your talent. Team chemistry can't manufacture talent, but it can take the talent you have and make the most of it. So team chemistry teams are what, I'm borrowing from the Golden State Warriors. They have this Just Us. They even have it on their championship rings. It's called Just Us because they are a Just Us team. It's all about these particular people at this particular time following this particular quest. Mm-hmm. And it's the leadership that emerges within that group. I have 7 archetype characters within that group that you generally see. And this is the part that it's not based on science at all. It's just observation and talking to players that you generally see these 7 archetypes emerge. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating is that somebody who's an archetype in one group, a particular archetype in one group, isn't necessarily that archetype in another group. Mm-hmm. So my theory is that the group itself manifests what it needs. And those players don't know there are those archetypes. Like, the jester doesn't necessarily know he's the jester, or the enforcer doesn't necessarily know he's the enforcer. But once you understand these archetypes and you look at them, and like in retrospect, I run these archetypes by players, coaches, and they could name every guy. Oh, so-and-so was this guy. So-and-so was this guy. Mm-hmm. It's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. Even the names you just gave there, I can. As soon as you said archetypes, I could think of what you were meaning there. Yeah, well, that's really interesting. So it's kind of these people adopt these roles. Is it is the us against the world kind of attitude that sometimes coaches can stoke that fire? Part of it as well.
Yes, and sometimes it's us against the front office. Mm-hmm. You're resenting the front office because they traded this one guy, or, they don't understand us, or they don't value us. That's a big thing. You don't feel valued, but together we know how valuable you are. Mm-hmm. And that's why team chemistry, when it's overlooked by coaches and front offices, they're so missing a bet. They so don't understand that inside the clubhouse or the locker room, there's a different value system, because those guys or women know who's actually contributing to this team performing better, because not everything shows up in a box score.
Yeah, I think that's a concern a lot of people are having. You mentioned analytics. The analytics view now is that 15 home runs and 10 steals from this guy is completely replaceable by this other guy, right? Who they are in the clubhouse seems to get lower and lower value. Right. So you're right. That is, yeah.
And they come up with that because it's shown over and over that does help the team win. Like, if you can get X production out of this guy. Mm-hmm. And actually, I was on a panel last month at the Sabre conference in Phoenix. Mm-hmm. And I was on a panel discussion. I was remote, but Brian Kenny was moderating, and he is a real sabermetrics guy. And we're old friends through my husband. And he asked that question. He said, now, if I'm a general manager and I hire, this guy to do this job, why shouldn't I expect that he just do that job? That's what I hired him for. I said, Brian, because they're not machines. They're human beings. Mm-hmm. And many, many things influence a human being. So you can't just slap a sticker on him and say, okay, this is the 15 home run guy. Yeah, you also have to say, okay, this is a human being. What motivates this human being? What is going on with it in their lives? Mm-hmm. So it's just so interesting how sometimes people forget that these are dads and sons and actual people who are forever influencing one another.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. We want to treat them like chess pieces sometimes, athletes, and we forget. Yeah.
Now, when I hear people say, they don't believe in team chemistry, or they do believe in team chemistry, I said, well, I don't say this, I'm thinking this. That's really not the word. It's like you can believe in God or not believe in God, or believe in Santa Claus or not believe in Santa Claus. Mm-hmm. But you either acknowledge that team chemistry exists, or you refuse to acknowledge that it exists, because it does, whether you think it does or not.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think your point, whether it has effect on performance, is kind of whether you believe it's a big factor in performance or not is. But you're right. People are going to interact and have chemistry dynamics between them, no matter what you do. So I think that's a really important point. So maybe going back to the performance, so you mentioned this point of how you separate teams that are just cohesive or getting along from ones where you actually seeing this chemistry effect? Can you talk a little bit about how you go about doing that?
Well, you can see when teams improve over what is expected of them, generally. So you look at a team and you're like, okay, going back to the analytics, maybe there's 8 home runs, whatever that might be. And you see that, oh, wait a minute, some guys are having career years with this team. Some guys are clearly emerging as leaders, even though their numbers aren't that great. So statistically, it has to be a team who improves. So the productivity goes up. That's one thing. But you also have to look at, so Johnny Gomes is like the classic example of somebody I call a super carrier of chemistry. So he's that guy in the clubhouse that the front office is not going to recognize as really a big contributor. So 2013 Boston Red Sox, I'll just tell you this story that to me kind of captured so much of what we're talking about. 2013 Red Sox, they get to the World Series with against the Cardinals. Cardinals are up 2-1 in the series. The lineup is posted for Game 4. John Farrell's the manager. And the leadership group in the clubhouse, Big Papi, Dustin Pedroia, John Lester, Jake Peavy, they look at the lineup and they go into John Farrell's office. And now the lineup has already gone out on social media, everything. And Johnny Gomes isn't in the lineup because of the pitching matchup. Mm-hmm. And, Johnny Gomes is a 242 lifetime hitter, hadn't had a hit in the series, and had maybe, a few hits in the entire postseason. So he shouldn't be in the lineup for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. They go in and they tell John Farrell, we want Johnny Gomes in the lineup tonight. And of course, Farrell balks. It's like, well, the lineup's up and it's kind of my job. And they wouldn't leave. They said, this is, we play better with Johnny in the lineup. Oh. And so Farrell, with really no choice, Shane Victorino suddenly has lower back tightness. And Johnny Gomes is in left field. Now, this part is coincidence, I think. But he's in the field. He ends up hitting a 3-run homer that puts the Red Sox ahead for good in that game. And they go on to win the series. Now, a lot of people will say, yeah, okay, they just believed he made them better. But the number and I think he ended up hitting like 216 for the postseason or something. But the number that his teammates look at is that they were 10-1 in games in which he played. And when I brought this to one of the neuroscientists at UC San Francisco, I said, look, here's the story. Now, what is the scientific evidence that he made a difference? That these guys might have just believed he makes them better. And he said, that is the evidence. He says, I don't know why we continue to dismiss our own experiences. And he says, did Johnny Gomes, did they win with Johnny Gomes? Yeah, they won. Did they really believe that he made a difference? Yes, they really believed it. And he said, well, that is the evidence. And guess what? Believing in something, it's the placebo effect. It's Dumbo's feather. He thought the magic feather made him fly. Of course it wasn't. So the other thing that strikes me is that almost everybody believes the yips exist, which we know from golf and we see it in baseball. Suddenly a player can't putt, a golfer can't putt, or somebody can't throw to first base. or a pitcher can't get the ball over. There's nothing wrong with their body, right? And everybody says, oh yeah, it's psychological, it's in their minds. Like, well, so if a belief can decrease your performance, can interfere with your performance, why couldn't belief elevate performance? But it's so hard for people to buy that part of that equation.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. I use the expression sometimes when I give presentations, saying is belief is the most powerful performance enhancing drug ever invented, right? We want to come up with some alternative that we can measure more easily, quantify, and it was this interaction or something. But you're right, that confidence, all those factors are so important. So yeah, if they believe it, that's probably the end of the story right there.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I guess, the other thing I was thinking about is from your research and your ideas about chemistry, is there a way that you can cultivate it in a team as an athlete or as a coach or a manager? Can you cultivate chemistry, or is it something that just kind of happens more naturally?
Well, I think it happens naturally and you can cultivate it. And again, I don't have the model for it. What I know is that you have to create a culture. Mm-hmm. And I think the culture precedes the chemistry. Create a culture of trust and of bonding. I mean, those are the two things. And that is what the military does. They create this culture in which trust and bonding can happen and deepen and deepen and deepen. So if you don't have that, and guess what? That's every relationship, right? Mm-hmm. Any friendship, marriage, even colleagues, if you don't have trust, and actually the truth is you don't necessarily have to have bonding in the way we think about bonding, but you definitely have to have trust. And trust takes a lot of different forms. Mm-hmm. So especially in sports, but probably in business as well. And one of the questions I'm always that I get challenged by is, well, what about those 1970s A's and 1970s Yankees that, were fighting in the clubhouse and then they go out and win all these championships? And, I really had to raise that question for myself. And like, well, why would that happen? And, what I came to understand is that there's social emotional chemistry that is hugely important for 99% of human beings, right? Yeah. And then there's task chemistry. So out on the field, they 100% trusted each other because they knew that the other guys on the field with them, and I'm just talking about baseball, but it applies to anything. The other guys on the field with him are as prepared, are as passionate about their craft, are as committed to winning as he is. Mm-hmm. So he knows out on that field, it's like soldiers in the battle, as I mentioned before. You're doing this because you trust the guy next to you, you trust he has your back, and you have his back. And, I have a whole chapter on Barry Bonds and Jeff Kent, who played together with the San Francisco Giants. And both of them are on, if you look at I think it was Bleacher Report did a list of the, top 10 worst teammates, that you'd ever want on your team. Barry Bonds and Jeff Kent are in the top, yeah. Right? So you would think those two together would just be explosive, and it was, but not out on the field. Mm-hmm. They, when I interviewed them for the book, each one of them said, oh yeah, they'd complain about the other, whatever. They said, Bond said, there's nobody else I want playing second base when I'm on the field. And Kent said, there's nobody else I want in left field than Barry Bonds. Do I want to have a drink with him? Never. But they had incredible chemistry that totally helped their performance and certainly helped the team's performance.
Yeah, I have my experience too, and what we understand about things like team cognition and decision making kind of agrees with all you're saying as well. Social cohesion and getting along and going out after the game is not necessarily the same as team chemistry, which I think is more about communication, understanding the weaknesses, the strengths of your teammates and different in the field. So I think I'm guessing you would send them in message, the typical things that people might do to promote team chemistry, like trying to go out more and doing these away trips where you do fall in each other's arms might help, but probably we need to be more like, in my belief about all practice, it needs to be fairly specific. We need to spend more time training, playing as a team, the actual game itself, rather than these kind of artificial things.
Well, I agree with you. It can't be artificial.
Yeah.
It has to be organic. And so when we see, these guys with the beards, or we see them all going out to dinner, that's the evidence of team chemistry. Mm-hmm. It's not the cause of team chemistry. Okay. So when you look at teams that do all of that, there's a reason why we say they have team chemistry, because, that's some evidence that they have it. Now, if they underperform and they're lackadaisical on the field, well, they don't have team chemistry. They just have camaraderie. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes if a team is doing well and they're going out to dinner, it's like, oh, okay, that's the evidence that they have team chemistry.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. I guess the last main point I wanted to ask you about is kind of this current situation we're in. I've been talking a lot about how people train now, and I just saw, before I got on this call with you, I saw an effort from one baseball team where they're trying to train together like this over Zoom and things. So how do you think, this kind of environment, hopefully it's not long-term, but this kind of environment where we're remotely training apart is going to affect team chemistry, if at all?
Well, it's a great question. We really don't know. I think it's tough to build that. But I also don't think you necessarily have to have that team chemistry on day one of the season. Team chemistry develops. Somebody tweeted me a question. It's like, well, what about like the Phillies had all this great team chemistry in the spring and they stunk. I said, well, you can't tell in spring if they have team chemistry because there's not been any competition. So that's just camaraderie. That's they're having a good time together. But you can't know if they have team chemistry. Mm-hmm. It develops. It doesn't just you show up and, oh, we like each other. That's not it at all.
I think a point you raised just remind me, team chemistry is, in your view, is probably also defined by how you handle adversity and challenge, right? Not just how you get along when everything's, when you're not in competition, right? Yeah.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. So what and I originally tried to quantify this, with this, real smart guy from Harvard. Mm-hmm. And so we looked at all different ways to enter into this big amorphous notion. And one of the things we looked at was, well, teams that we have identified as having good chemistry, did they have shorter losing streaks and longer winning streaks? So when they did start to lose, they didn't just keep going down that hole. And, absolutely, of course, there were good chemistry teams that did that, but there wasn't enough data to say, oh, great chemistry shortens your losing streaks and lengthens your winning streaks. But that goes to your adversity question and the belief that when you're a just us team and you trust that these are the right people for this quest, you are going to believe it. Even when you start losing, you're going to be like, well, that's not us. They're not going to believe what has just happened, that's them. No, we already know who we are.
Right.
So we just do what we do and everything is going to turn around.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've studied kind of individual level streaks, slumps, and streaks. And I essentially find the same thing, right? Those are going to happen. It just statistically, right? And the people that get out of them are the ones that don't change anything, basically. They still have the belief, I'm just going to keep what I'm doing and it's going to get better. The ones that go into a really long trough is when they try to change something about what they're doing because they've lost 3 games in a row or something.
And also their teammates can help them. That the teammates can say, you are not this. You are better than this. And I believe in you. And there's that other person that and actually really, turn us around. We're in our own little pea brains, knocking around with all these, thoughts in our heads that get darker and darker because, I struck out again. And that teammate or two that can come up to you that you trust completely, you believe this person. Because, somebody else could tell you, you're not going to believe it. The messenger means everything, right? I'm going to listen because I trust this messenger. And that's where that trust and bonding really matters and can help somebody come out of a slump. And, there's one thing I want to make sure I get in here before we end is that when I was really trying to crystallize, well, what is what is the experience of team chemistry? What is the player experience of chemistry? And I talked to Jake Peavy, who was a Cy Young pitcher, and he was on that 2013 team and, ultimately was on the Giants. And you watch anybody who has seen Jake Peavy on the mound, he's that stomper and that snorter and the guy who is just giving 150% on the mound. He's just thrumming with commitment and energy. And I asked him, I said, Jake, team chemistry, lifts performance and helps a lot of people, but tell me how it helps you. I mean, you can't give more than 100%. So why does team chemistry even matter to you? And he said, going back to the open loops, my teammates bring out a fight in me I can't willingly summon for myself. And I thought, wow, that's it. Yeah. That is it. And so the question is, how do you create that culture in which he feels that way about his teammates, that his teammates can have that much impact, that they physically bring something, another level in him that he knows he can't summon if not for them.
Well, that's great, Joan. That sounds really, really interesting book. So you mentioned it's coming out in a couple of weeks?
Coming out in a couple of weeks. People can order. It's Intangibles, Unlocking the Science and Soul of Team Chemistry. You can order it online anywhere books are sold. Yeah, so don't wait until the pub date because you're still going to have to order it online and then be first in line to get it. And I'm really, really proud of it. And I'm really, really glad I'm finished.
I bet. Yeah, Amazon's pretty slow right now, so you might get ahead of the game.
Yeah, get ahead of the game or go to indiebound.org or bookshop.org to support your local independent bookstores.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's good. Good tip. So thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Joan.
Oh, thanks, Robert. This was fascinating. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Joan. You can find more information and links to purchase Intangibles in the show notes. And remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.